September of 2023, I accepted a contract position with the National Weather Service to staff a remote automated surface observing station in the northern interior of Alaska. The station's official designation was ASOS, Node 7741, but it had a name among the few people who knew about it. They called it Graver Ridge. The job listing was unusual. I found it not on any government hiring portal, but through a forwarded email from a former colleague who worked in atmospheric sciences at the University of Fairbanks. He sent it with a single line of text. "You'd be perfect for this, and I wouldn't take it if they tripled the pay." I thought he was being dramatic. The listing described a 12-month deployment to maintain and monitor a weather station at high elevation in a region so remote that supply deliveries came once every 6 weeks by bushplane, weather permitting. The pay was extraordinary, just under $90,000 for a single year, housing and food included. The requirements were minimal. You needed a background in meteorology or a related field. You needed to pass a physical, and you needed to sign a waiver acknowledging limited emergency evacuation capability between the months of November and March. That last part should have meant more to me than it did. I was 34 at the time, recently divorced, working a dead-end forecast desk job in Reno that made me feel like I was dissolving one shift at a time. I had a degree in atmospheric science I'd never properly used. I had no kids, no mortgage, no one who would check on me if I vanished for a year. The listing felt like it had been written for me specifically, and maybe that should have been the first warning, that sensation of a door opening at exactly the moment you need one. I applied. I was contacted within 48 hours. The interview was a single phone call with a woman who identified herself as a logistics coordinator named Dana. She asked me 3 questions. Could I tolerate extended solitude? Had I ever experienced hallucinations, psychotic episodes, or severe depressive events? Was I comfortable with firearms? I said yes, no, and yes. She said the position was mine if I wanted it. I asked one question of my own. Why was the pay so high? There was a pause. Then she said, in a voice that sounded carefully rehearsed, "Retention has been a challenge. The conditions are harsh. Most people leave before their contract ends." I asked how many people had held the position. Another pause. "You would be the 9th. I didn't ask what happened to the other 8. I was too eager, too hungry for a clean exit from my own life. And I think somewhere beneath that, I believed I was tougher than whoever came before me. That's the kind of thing you believe when you haven't yet been tested by anything real. I arrived at Graver Ridge on September 14th by bushplane. The pilot was a leathery, quiet man named Harlan who flew for the NWS subcontractor that serviced the station. He helped me unload 4 months' worth of supplies onto a frost-heaved gravel landing strip and then stood with his hands in his pockets, staring at the station for a long time. It sat on a treeless ridge at roughly 3,000 feet of elevation, surrounded by a vast bowl of tundra that stretched in every direction until it hit the Brooks Range on the northern horizon. The station itself was a squat, rectangular prefab building. Metal walls, reinforced roof, small windows. Beside it stood a cluster of weather instruments on a steel platform, an anemometer, a ceilometer, a temperature and humidity sensor array, a precipitation gauge, A short radio tower rose from the roof. A diesel generator hummed in a shed nearby. That was it. That was the whole world. Harlan looked at me and said, "You seem like a decent guy." I thanked him. He said, "The last decent guy lasted until January. Then he got in his plane and flew south, and I was alone. The first few weeks were something close to beautiful." I know that sounds strange, given what I'm about to describe, but I need you to understand that the place wasn't immediately threatening. It was open. It was enormous. The air was so clean, it almost hurt to breathe. I'd step outside at dawn and the light would come sliding across the tundra in sheets of gold, and the silence was so complete I could hear my own blood moving. My job was straightforward. I maintained the instruments. I calibrated sensors. I logged supplementary observations that the automated system couldn't capture. Things like ice crystal formations, unusual cloud behavior, visibility during ground blizzards. I transmitted reports twice daily via satellite uplink. I kept the generator running. I shoveled snow when it came. I cooked simple meals and read paperback novels, and sometimes sat on the front step and just watched the sky change color for an hour. For a man who had spent 2 years feeling like his life was a slow leak, it was the first time I could breathe. October was when the light began to leave. Not all at once, but in noticeable increments, like someone turning down a dimmer switch a little more each day. By the end of the month, I was getting maybe 6 hours of usable daylight. The temperature dropped below zero and didn't come back up. The tundra turned white. The wind picked up and became a constant companion. Not a gust, but a presence. A low, endless pressure against the walls of the station that never fully stopped. It was also in October that I found the journals. There was a storage closet in the back of the station, behind the supply shelves, and in a plastic bin shoved against the far wall, I found 5 notebooks. They were different brands, different sizes, clearly left by different people. They were the personal journals of previous station keepers. I should have left them alone. The first one was practical. Dated entries from 2016. Notes about equipment maintenance, weather patterns, a few complaints about the food supply. It ended in mid-December with a final entry that said simply, "Leaving tomorrow. Can't do another night of this." No explanation of what this was. The second was similar, but more emotional. Whoever wrote it, the handwriting suggested a woman, described growing anxiety through November, difficulty sleeping, a persistent feeling of being observed from outside the station, despite the nearest human settlement being over 100 miles away. Her last entry in late January read, "I keep hearing my name in the wind. I know that's not possible. I know that, but I hear it. I hear it clearly. I'm requesting extraction." The third journal was the one that changed things for me. It was written by someone with neat, engineer-like handwriting, and it was meticulous. Every entry was dated and timed. This person had been methodical about documenting what they experienced. And what they experienced was this. Starting in late November, the weather instruments began recording data that was impossible. Not unusual, impossible. Temperature readings that dropped to values the sensors weren't designed to measure. Readings that, if accurate, would have meant conditions colder than the surface of Mars. Barometric pressure fluctuations that occurred in rhythmic cycles, almost like breathing. wind speed measurements that alternated between dead calm and extreme gusts in precise 30-second intervals, as if something was switching the wind on and off. The author of that journal had recalibrated every instrument, replaced sensors, checked wiring. Everything was functioning perfectly. The instruments weren't malfunctioning. They were accurately measuring something that shouldn't have been there. The last entry in that journal said, the station recorded a temperature of -112 degrees Fahrenheit at 3:17 a.m. I was standing outside at the time. It felt warm. That's when I knew I needed to leave. The fourth and fifth journals were fragmentary, short, panicked entries. One of them had pages torn out. The other simply stopped mid-sentence. I sat on the floor of that storage closet for a long time after reading them. I want to say I was skeptical. I want to say I chalked it up to isolation psychology, cabin fever, the well-documented mental strain of polar environments, and that is what I told myself. But my hands were shaking when I put the journals back in the bin, and I think the honest part of my brain, the part that doesn't bother with ego or self-deception, had already begun to understand that I was in a place where something was wrong in a way I didn't have language for yet. November came in like a door slamming shut. The last of the daylight compressed into a thin grey band on the southern horizon that lasted maybe 2 hours before the dark swallowed it again. The temperature settled into a permanent range between -20 and -40. The wind became violent. There were days I couldn't open the front door of the station because the gusts would have knocked me flat, and the instruments began to do exactly what the journal described. It started small, a temperature reading that dipped 15 degrees below what my handheld thermometer showed, then corrected itself. A pressure spike that lasted 4 seconds and vanished. I logged these as sensor artifacts and moved on. But they got worse, or more precisely, they got more organized. By mid-November, I was recording anomalies every night between 2 and 4 a.m. The temperature sensor would plunge. The barometer would oscillate in that rhythmic pattern. Slow, regular, 3-second intervals. The anemometer would spin up to readings that indicated winds of over 100 miles per hour, while the air outside my window was perfectly still. I want to be very clear about this. I went outside during these events. I checked. The air was calm. The temperature, by handheld measurement, was cold but normal for the region and season. There was no wind. But the instruments, I had calibrated myself. Instruments I trusted were screaming. I reported the anomalies in my satellite transmissions. The responses I got were bland. Sensor degradation, consistent with extreme cold environment. Replacement parts, on next supply delivery. They weren't listening, or they'd heard it before, and had decided it didn't matter. The first time I heard it, I was lying in my bunk at approximately 2:40 a.m. on November 23rd. The generator was running. The wind was modest, maybe 15 knots. I was half asleep, drifting in that liminal space where your thoughts stop making grammatical sense. And then, beneath the wind, threaded through it like a voice buried in static, I heard something. It wasn't a word. It wasn't my name. It was more like a tone. A low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the floor, from the ridge itself. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then it stopped, and the wind filled the silence like water rushing into a hole. I sat up in bed. My heart was hammering. I checked the instruments. During those 10 seconds, every sensor had flatlined, not spiked, not dropped, flatlined, as if, for 10 seconds, there had been no atmosphere to measure. I told myself it was the wind. I told myself the harmonics of air moving over a ridge could produce resonant frequencies. I told myself the sensors had glitched. I told myself I was tired. I told myself a lot of things in November. December was when the darkness became absolute. There is no way to explain what 24-hour night does to your mind unless you've lived it. You lose time, not in a dramatic horror movie way, in a quiet, insidious way. You look at the clock and it says 2:15 p.m., but the world outside is black and star-filled, and your body insists it's the middle of the night. Your circadian rhythm doesn't just drift, it dissolves. You sleep in fragments. You eat at random times. You start to feel unmoored from the basic architecture of human existence, because day and night are the oldest rhythm we have, and without them, something fundamental in you goes slack. I started keeping every light in the station on at all times. I started setting alarms every 2 hours just to have a structure to hold on to. I started talking to myself. 4 conversations, out loud, about nothing. The sound of a human voice, even my own, was a rope I could grab. The hum came more frequently. Every few nights at first, then every other night, then nightly. Always between 2 and 4 a.m. Always that same low, resonant tone that seemed to come from inside the ridge, and every time it came, the instruments flatlined. Every time. I started going outside during the events, standing on the ridge in the dark, in the cold, trying to locate the source. I never could. It wasn't directional. It was omnidirectional, as if the air itself was vibrating at a frequency just below what human hearing is designed to process. I could feel it more than hear it. A pressure in my chest, a buzzing in my teeth, a sensation like standing too close to a massive engine that was idling just beneath the ground. On December 9th, during one of these episodes, I looked up at the sky and saw something I cannot explain. The stars went out. Not all of them. Sections of the sky, roughly 30 degrees across, directly above the station, went dark, as if something enormous and perfectly black had moved between me and the stars. It lasted maybe 20 seconds. Then the stars returned, all at once, and the hum stopped, and the instruments came back online. I went inside and sat at the desk and stared at my hands for a very long time. I considered requesting extraction. I had the satellite phone. I had the emergency protocol. But extraction between November and March was functionally impossible. The bush planes couldn't fly in the conditions. The nearest road was 200 miles south. I would have had to wait for a weather window, and the weather windows in deep winter at that latitude could be weeks apart. I was trapped, and I think whatever was on that ridge knew it. January was when things changed in a way that I struggled to describe, because it moves out of the territory of events and into the territory of perception. The hum was no longer occasional. It was constant, a low, subsonic presence that I felt more than heard, always there, like tinnitus of the earth. The instruments had stopped making sense entirely. They would display readings from all 4 seasons in the span of an hour. Spring temperatures, summer humidity, autumn pressure, then plunging back into values that belonged to no earthly climate. And I began to see things on the tundra. Not creatures, not figures, lights, faint pale blue lights that moved slowly across the snow at a distance I couldn't judge. They could have been 100 yards away or a mile. They didn't behave like any atmospheric phenomenon I'd studied. They didn't flicker like St. Elmo's fire. They didn't arc like auroras. They moved with what I can only describe as intention, tracing paths across the tundra that seemed deliberate, almost geometric. Circles, arcs, patterns that repeated. I filmed them. I have the footage. It shows nothing. Just darkness. Whatever those lights were, they didn't register on camera. Only on the human eye. Only on me. By late January, I had stopped sleeping in any meaningful way. I would doze for 45 minutes, wake drenched in sweat, lie in the dark listening to the hum, and then get up and check the instruments because the routine was the only thing keeping me functional. I had lost weight. My hands trembled. I talked to myself constantly, but the conversations had become strange. I would catch myself mid-sentence, arguing a point I didn't remember starting, responding to a question no one had asked. The loneliest moment of my life happened on January 28th. It was 3 a.m. I was standing at the window, watching the lights move on the tundra, and I realized I had pressed my hand flat against the glass. The cold was so extreme that my skin was sticking to it, and I hadn't noticed. I pulled my hand away and left skin behind, a near-perfect palm print of raw flesh on the glass, and I felt nothing. No pain, no alarm. I just stood there looking at my bleeding hand and thought very clearly and very calmly, this place is digesting me. That thought didn't feel like mine. It felt like something that had been placed in my head, the way you'd place a book on a shelf. Gently, precisely. In exactly the right spot. February. I need to talk about February. The supply plane was supposed to come on February 3rd. It didn't. I raised Harlan on the satellite phone, and he said the weather was impossible. Storms stacked on storms. Conditions he'd never seen in 30 years of bush flying. He said he'd try again the following week. He sounded worried, but not about the weather. He sounded worried about me. He asked me how I was doing, and I said fine. And he was quiet for a long time, and then said, nobody's ever made it to February before. I asked him what that meant. He said, it means I figured I'd be picking up an empty station. I asked him what happened to the others. He told me. Not all of them, but enough. 2 had requested emergency extraction and were pulled out in states of severe psychological distress. 1 of them never returned to work in any capacity. 3 had simply walked away from the station and were found miles away on the tundra, hypothermic and incoherent, babbling about the sound under the ground. 1 was never found at all. His personal effects were still in the station when Harlan arrived for the scheduled spring pickup. His boots were still by the door. His jacket was still on the hook. But he was gone, and the snow around the station showed no footprints. The supply plane didn't come on February 3rd or the following week. The storms continued, relentless, impossible in their persistence and intensity. I began rationing food. I began rationing generator fuel. I began rationing myself, portioning out my sanity in careful increments, deciding how much fear I could afford to feel each day without breaking. On the night of February 14th, the hum stopped. I want you to understand what that felt like. For weeks, that low, subsonic vibration had been constant, a presence so persistent that I'd stopped consciously noticing it, the way you stopped noticing the sound of your own refrigerator. When it stopped, the silence was so total and so sudden that I gasped. It was like a hand had been pressing on my chest for a month and suddenly let go. I stood in the middle of the station, breathing hard, listening to nothing, true nothing, no wind, no generator. I realized the generator had stopped too. No hum, no sound of any kind. A silence so absolute it had texture, weight, density. I could feel it against my skin. And then the temperature inside the station began to drop. Not gradually, not the way a building cools when the heat goes off. It plummeted. I could see my breath. Then I could see frost forming on the inside of the windows. Then I could see ice crystallizing on the surface of the water in my drinking glass, spreading from the edges inward in delicate fractal patterns. And it was beautiful. And I hated that it was beautiful, because beauty in that moment felt like a lure. I put on every layer of clothing I had. I tried the generator. It wouldn't start. I tried the satellite phone. Dead. I tried the radio. Static. Not normal static, but a low, rhythmic static that pulsed in 3-second intervals, like breathing. The temperature inside the station dropped below 0, then below -10, then below -20. I could feel the cold moving through the walls as if they weren't there, as if the building was becoming transparent to whatever was outside. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't in the wind. There was no wind. It wasn't in the walls. It came from beneath me, from the ridge itself, from somewhere deep in the frozen rock under my feet. A voice that wasn't a voice. It had no words, no language, no human quality. But it communicated with the same unmistakable clarity as language. It pressed meaning directly into my mind, the way the cold was pressing through the walls. What it communicated was not a threat. It was not a warning. It was not malevolent. It was an invitation. I understood in that moment, with a certainty that bypassed thought entirely, what had happened to the man whose boots were still by the door. He had accepted. He had understood the invitation, and he had said yes, and he had walked out into the cold, not because he was confused or insane, but because he had been offered something, and what he'd been offered was so vast and so incomprehensible that saying yes was the only response that made sense. I stood in the center of that freezing station, and I felt the invitation settle over me like a blanket, and for a span of time I cannot accurately measure it. It felt like hours, but may have been seconds. I considered accepting. The thing beneath the ridge was old. That was the overwhelming impression. Not old like a mountain is old like a law of physics is old like darkness is old. It had been there before the ridge, before the tundra, before the ice. The ridge had formed around it the way a pearl forms around a grain of sand, and it was aware, not intelligent in any way I could map onto human cognition, but aware of the station, aware of the instruments, aware of me. It had been aware of all of us, every station keeper who had come to Graver Ridge, and it had reached out to each of us in the same way, with the same slow, patient invitation. the way a deep-sea creature bioluminesces in the dark. Not hunting, just calling, just seeing who would come closer. The instruments hadn't been malfunctioning. They had been measuring it. The impossible temperatures, the rhythmic pressure, the winds that weren't there. They were the vital signs of something alive beneath the permafrost. Something that breathed in cycles of decades. Something that dreamed in frequencies just below human hearing. Something that woke a little more each winter when the dark was deepest and the cold was most absolute and the barrier between its world and ours was thinnest. I said no. I don't know why. I don't know what part of me refused. It wasn't courage. It wasn't rationality. It was something smaller and more stubborn than that. Maybe just the animal part of my brain that knew at some fundamental level that I was warm-blooded and soft-bodied and I belonged in the light. I said no, and the cold receded. Not immediately. Slowly, like a tide going out. The generator coughed and started. The satellite phone blinked back to life. The hum returned, but quieter, more distant, like something pulling away. The temperature inside the station climbed back above freezing by dawn. I spent the rest of February in a state I can only describe as aftermath. The hum was still there, but it had diminished to a faint vibration I could only feel if I pressed my palm flat against the floor. The lights on the tundra didn't return. The instruments still recorded anomalies, but smaller ones, as if whatever was beneath the ridge had lost interest or was settling back into dormancy. The supply plane came on March 1st. Harlan landed on the strip and walked toward the station, and when I opened the door, he stared at me for a long time. He told me later that I looked like I'd aged 10 years. My hair, which had been dark brown in September, was streaked with grey. I'd lost over 30 pounds. My eyes, he said, looked like the eyes of someone who'd been staring at an eclipse. I left Graver Ridge that morning. I walked out of the station and across the gravel strip and climbed into Harlan's plane, and I didn't look back. I couldn't. I was afraid that if I looked back, I'd see something in the sky above the ridge. Something dark, something vast, something that was watching me leave with the patient disinterest of a creature that knows the next one will say yes. I filed my final report with the NWS. I described equipment malfunctions and harsh conditions. I said nothing about the hum, the lights, the voice, the invitation. I knew how it would sound. I knew what they would do with that information, which was nothing, because they already knew. Dana, the logistics coordinator, called me after I submitted the report. She thanked me for completing the contract. She asked if I had any observations I wanted to add off the record. I said, "You know what's under that ridge." She was quiet for 5 seconds. Then she said, "The position is being relisted. Would you like to provide a recommendation for your replacement?" I hung up. That was 14 months ago. I live in Tucson now. I chose it for the heat, the sun, the dryness. Everything Graver Ridge was not. I sleep with the lights on. I keep a thermometer on my nightstand, and I check it when I wake up at 3 a.m., which I do every night, without fail, at 3 a.m. The temperature in my bedroom is always normal. The air is always still. There is no hum. But sometimes, on the coldest nights, and Tucson does get cold nights, despite what people think, I press my palm flat against the floor, and I hold my breath, and I wait. I'm not sure what I'm waiting for. That's not true. I am sure. I just don't want to say it. I'm waiting to feel it again, that low, resonant vibration, that patient, ancient pulse. Because the worst thing about Graver Ridge wasn't the cold, or the dark, or the fear. The worst thing is that the invitation is still open. I can feel it, even here, even 14 months later, even in the desert, even in the sun. It's still open. And some part of me, some quiet, stubborn part that doesn't belong to the light, is still considering it. The listing for ASOS, node 7741, went back up 6 weeks after I left. I check it sometimes. I don't know why. The pay has been raised to 110,000. The contract length has been shortened to 8 months. As of last week, someone accepted the position. I thought about calling them, warning them, telling them everything. I've told you, but I didn't. Because the truth is, nothing I say will matter. The truth is, you can't explain Graver Ridge to someone who hasn't felt it. You can only describe the shape of the hole and hope they're smart enough not to look over the edge. And the deeper truth, the one I circle at 3 a.m. with my hand pressed to the floor and my eyes on the thermometer, the deeper truth is that I'm not sure saying no was the right choice. I'm not sure the people who walked into the cold were lost. I'm not sure the man whose boots stayed by the door didn't find exactly what he was looking for. I'm not sure of anything anymore, except that winter is coming again, and the thing beneath the ridge is patient, and it will ask the next one the same question it asked me. And one of these days, one of these cold Tucson nights, I'm going to stop checking the thermometer. I'm going to stop pressing my palm to the floor. I'm going to book a flight to Fairbanks, and I'm going to find Harlan, and I'm going to ask him to take me back to Graver Ridge. Not because I'm brave, not because I'm broken, because I finally have my answer, and it terrifies me that the answer is yes.